I never thought a simple storm could trap me in a room with him, my stepson. But as the thunder roared outside, the tension inside grew unbearable. His eyes lingered too long, and when he whispered my name, my heart betrayed me. I should have stopped it then, but I didn't. And now, as the night unfolds, I know nothing will ever be the same again. I used to think my life was predictable, safe even. Married for 12 years, I had built a home filled with routines and responsibilities. My husband, Mark, was a workaholic, always traveling for business, leaving me to manage the house alone. I told myself it was just part of marriage, this quiet loneliness, but deep down I missed being noticed, being wanted. Mark's son, Ryan, came into my life when he was just 14. I watched him grow from a quiet, awkward teenager into a confident 22-year-old man. He had his father's sharp features but carried himself with a softer, more approachable demeanor. Though we weren't related by blood, I always treated him like family, until the night that changed everything. It started with a storm. Mark was out of town, as usual, and the house felt larger, emptier than ever. I had just finished tidying up after dinner when the doorbell rang. My heart skipped a beat. Who would visit in weather like this? When I opened the door, Ryan stood there, drenched from the rain, his shirt clinging to his chest. He gave me a sheepish smile and said, "Dad said I could crash here for a few days. Hope that's okay." I welcomed him in, handing him a towel, but the way his eyes lingered on mine sent a shiver down my spine. I brushed it off. It was just the oddness of the moment, I told myself. After all, I'd known him for years. As the evening went on, we talked like we always did, comfortably. He teased me about my obsession with neatness, and I teased him back about his messy habits. It felt normal, until it didn't. Later that night, the storm knocked out the power, and we found ourselves locked in my bedroom, the old door jammed shut. Ryan offered to sleep on the floor, but I insisted we share the bed. It was innocent enough, or so I thought. But as we lay there in the dim light, the distance between us felt smaller, and the tension heavier. I could feel his presence, his warmth, and suddenly, I wasn't sure where the line between right and wrong was anymore. The rain hammered against the windows as the storm raged on. The room felt smaller by the second, the dim light casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Ryan sat at the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on the floor, while I nervously adjusted the blanket around me. I told myself it was the storm, the isolation, the tension of being trapped together, that made the air feel heavier. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. It was him. Ryan had always been polite, respectful. But tonight, there was something different. I caught him looking at me, his eyes lingering a moment too long before darting away. And the way he said my name, so soft, so deliberate, sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the storm instead. "It should pass soon," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. Ryan nodded, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "I don't mind being stuck here with you," he said. His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. My stomach twisted, but I forced a laugh to break the tension. "Careful, or I'll make you help me clean the closets to pass the time." He smiled, but there was something behind it, something I couldn't quite place. I looked away, trying to focus on anything but him. But the more I tried, the more aware I became of his presence. The warmth of his body just inches away, the soft rise and fall of his chest. And then it happened, an accident, I told myself. I shifted under the covers, and my arm brushed against his. It was barely a touch, but it was enough to make my breath catch. "Sorry," I murmured, pulling away quickly. "It's fine," he said, his voice low. "You don't have to be so nervous around me." Nervous? Was it that obvious? I turned toward him, intending to brush off his comment, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It was intense, too intense, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "This is ridiculous," I said, trying to laugh again, but it came out shaky. "We're just stuck in a room. That's all." "Is it?" he asked softly. I froze. What did he mean? I searched his face for an answer, but his expression was unreadable. And yet, there was something there, a flicker of something dangerous and thrilling all at once. I wanted to stop it. I should have stopped it. But instead, I stayed frozen, my pulse quickening as the silence stretched between us. "Ryan," I started, but he leaned closer, just enough to make my breath hitch. "You can trust me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know that, right?" And that was the moment. The moment I realized this wasn't just the storm, or the darkness, or the isolation. It was him. And it was me. And no matter how hard I tried to deny it, something had already shifted between us. The room felt warmer, the space between us smaller, and as the minutes dragged on, I knew one thing for certain. This night wasn't over, and neither was the tension. The storm outside refused to let up, but inside, it was the storm between us that felt impossible to ignore. I lay on my side, pretending to sleep, but every movement Ryan made sent ripples through the mattress, keeping me wide awake. I could feel him watching me, his breath steady, but his presence heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. My skin tingled, every nerve aware of how close he was. "Clara." His voice was soft, hesitant. I didn't answer at first, hoping he'd think I'd drifted off. But then his hand brushed against my arm, just barely, and it sent a jolt through me. I turned toward him slowly, my eyes meeting his in the dim light. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice unsteady. He didn't speak right away. Instead, his gaze held mine, searching, as if he was looking for something, permission maybe, or a sign that I felt what he felt. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But being here with you tonight, it feels different. Like I'm seeing you, really seeing you, for the first time." My heart slammed against my ribs. "Ryan, we can't." "I know," he said quickly, cutting me off. "I know we shouldn't. But that doesn't make it go away." I sat up, creating distance between us, but he followed, sitting up too. "This is crazy," I said, shaking my head. "You're Mark's son. This isn't right." "Stop," he said, reaching out and gently grabbing my wrist. His touch was warm, grounding, and I hated how much I didn't want him to let go. "Don't say that. Don't act like this is nothing." "It has to be nothing," I said, my voice trembling. But my resolve was slipping, and he knew it. He moved closer, his face just inches from mine. "What if it's not?" I should have pulled away. I should have told him to stop. But instead, I stayed frozen, my breath shallow as his fingers slid down my arm, sending shivers in their wake. "Tell me you don't feel it," he whispered. "Tell me and I'll stop." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Because the truth was, I did feel it, the pull, the heat, the terrifying temptation. His fingers brushed my cheek, and I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch before I could stop myself. "This is wrong," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. "Then why does it feel so right?" he murmured, his lips so close I could feel his breath against my skin. My pulse pounded in my ears as his thumb traced the curve of my jaw. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't seem to step away from the flames. And then it happened. Slowly, cautiously, he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if he was giving me time to stop him. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I melted into it, my hands gripping his shirt as if holding on to something solid would keep me from falling deeper. When we finally pulled apart, the silence was deafening. My mind raced, screaming at me to fix this, to undo it somehow, but my body betrayed me, leaning closer instead of away. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something we shouldn't," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "But something that feels impossible to stop." I closed my eyes, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. "We can't," I whispered, even as my hands stayed on his chest, refusing to let go. "I know," he said, his voice strained. "But do you really want me to leave?" I couldn't answer, because the truth scared me more than anything, that I didn't want him to go. That even as every part of me screamed this was wrong, there was another part, a louder part, that didn't care. The tension between us thickened, the weight of the moment pressing down until it felt like I couldn't breathe. And then he kissed me again, deeper this time, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The storm outside had quieted, but inside, the storm we'd unleashed was just beginning. The room was suffocating. The warmth of Ryan's body lingered on my skin, and yet I felt frozen in place, paralyzed by the weight of what we had just done. My lips still tingled from his kiss, and the faint trace of his touch burned against my skin like a mark I couldn't erase. But reality came crashing down around me. I pulled away, my breath shaky. "Ryan, we can't do this." My voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of desperation. His eyes searched mine, pleading. "Clara, please. Don't act like this didn't mean something. I know you felt it too." I stood up, creating distance between us, my arms wrapped tightly around myself as if they could shield me from the guilt clawing at my chest. "It doesn't matter what I felt. This is wrong. You're my stepson." "Mark! Mark!" Ryan interrupted, bitterness seeping into his voice. "When's the last time Mark even looked at you the way I just did? When's the last time he made you feel like this?" His words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to protest, to defend my husband, but nothing came out. Because he was right. Mark hadn't touched me in months. hadn't looked at me like I was someone worth wanting. But that didn't make this okay. Tears welled up in my eyes as I shook my head. This isn't about him. It's about us and what we just did. It can't happen again. It can't. Ryan stood, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming. What if it already has? What if it's not just this one night? What if it's been there all along, and we've just been too afraid to admit it? I stumbled back until my legs hit the edge of the bed, forcing me to sit. Ryan, stop. My voice broke and tears spilled down my cheeks. But he didn't stop. He knelt in front of me, his hands gripping mine. I can't stop, Clara. I don't want to stop. Before I could respond, the door rattled. A sharp knock cut through the tension like a knife. Clara? Are you in there? Mark's voice. Panic seized me. I looked at Ryan, my eyes wide. Mark! My voice cracked as I shot to my feet, yanking my hands free from Ryan's grip. Ryan froze, his expression hardening. He's not supposed to be home yet. But he was. I rushed to the door, fumbling with the handle that had been stuck earlier. My hands shook as I pulled and twisted, praying it would open. It didn't. Clara! Mark's voice was sharper now. What's going on? Open the door. Ryan stepped up behind me, his breath warm against my neck. Let me handle this. No! I hissed, shoving him back. You've done enough. I pressed my forehead against the door, trying to steady my breathing. The lock's jammed. I called out. I can't get it open. Step back, Mark said. I'll push it open. I staggered away from the door, dragging Ryan with me just as Mark forced it open with a loud crack. He stood in the doorway, his eyes moving between us. First to me, disheveled, my cheeks flushed, and then to Ryan, his shirt wrinkled and his hair a mess. The silence was deafening. What's going on here? Mark's voice was low, dangerous. Ryan stepped forward, his jaw tight. Nothing. The door was stuck, and the storm. Don't! Mark's voice cut through the room. His eyes locked on mine, and I saw it, the realization, the hurt. Clara! His voice broke. Tears streamed down my face. It's not what you think. But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. Mark's eyes darkened and his fists clenched. How long? Mark, stop. I stepped toward him, but he held up his hand, stopping me in my tracks. How long, Clara? I couldn't answer. The room spun, the weight of my betrayal crashing down on me. Ryan tried to speak, but Mark cut him off with a look that could kill. I trusted you, he said, his voice hollow. Both of you. The hurt in his voice was unbearable. I reached out for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. Don't! And with that, he turned and walked away. I collapsed onto the bed, my sobs echoing through the room as Ryan stood silently, his face pale. The damage was done. And no matter how much I wanted to turn back time, it was too late. The silence after Mark left was unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of his voice. It was the weight of what had been shattered in that moment. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands trembling, my mind racing through every word, every look, every mistake that led to this. Ryan stood frozen, his back to me, staring at the door as if Mark might walk back in and undo everything. But he wouldn't. He'll never forgive me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ryan turned, his face pale but determined. He'll come around. He just needs time. I shook my head. No, Ryan. This isn't something time can fix. I looked up at him then, and for the first time I saw it. Not the young man I'd watched grow up, but someone who had crossed a line with me that neither of us could uncross. And the worst part was that I didn't regret it. Clara, he said softly, stepping closer. You can't shut me out now. Shut you out. My voice cracked as I stood, the anger and guilt colliding inside me. Ryan, do you even understand what just happened? I destroyed my marriage. I destroyed my family. For what? For us, he said, his voice firm, his eyes pleading. For something real. Something worth fighting for. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But reality hit me harder than any storm ever could. We don't have an U.S., Ryan, I said, my voice shaking. We had a moment. A mistake. His jaw tightened. Is that what it was to you? A mistake. I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. It doesn't matter what it was. It's over. But as I said the words, my chest tightened, and I felt the weight of my own lie. Because even now, even with everything falling apart, I didn't want him to leave. Ryan's voice softened. You don't mean that. I closed my eyes, willing myself not to cry again. I have to. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine outside snapped me back to reality. Mark. He hadn't left. My heart sank as I rushed to the window. Sure enough, his car was still there. He was sitting in the driver's seat, but he hadn't driven away. What's he doing? Ryan asked, stepping up behind me. I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But deep down, I did know. He was deciding whether to walk away or come back inside and finish what had been left unsaid. I turned to Ryan. You need to leave. Now. He didn't move. Clara. Go. I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. You can't be here when he comes back inside. His face hardened, but after a moment he nodded. I'll go. But this isn't over. I didn't answer as he grabbed his jacket and slipped out the door. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, pacing the room, my nerves fraying with each passing second. When I finally heard the front door open, my stomach dropped. Mark's footsteps echoed through the house until he reached the bedroom. He stood in the doorway, his face pale but calm. We need to talk, he said. I swallowed hard, nodding. I know. The conversation that followed was a blur of accusations, anger, and pain. He demanded answers I couldn't give, and I begged for forgiveness I knew I didn't deserve. In the end, he didn't yell. He didn't scream. He just looked at me with eyes full of hurt and said, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. And then he left, really left this time. The sound of the door closing behind him was like a knife to my chest. I sank to the floor, sobbing as the weight of everything crashed down on me. I had lost him. And the worst part was, I didn't even know if I wanted him back. The fallout was just beginning, and I had no idea how to pick up the pieces. The days after Mark left felt endless, silent and suffocating. The house, once filled with familiar routines, felt hollow. I moved through it like a ghost, haunted by memories of what used to be. Mark didn't call. He didn't text. And when I tried reaching out, I was met with nothing but silence. It was worse than anger, it was indifference. And it terrified me. Ryan, on the other hand, wouldn't stay away. He called. He texted. He even showed up at my door once, but I didn't let him in. I couldn't. I needed time, to think, to breathe, to figure out who I had become. Because the truth was, the woman I saw in the mirror wasn't someone I recognized anymore. She was reckless, impulsive, selfish. But the scariest part? She was alive. For the first time in years, I had felt something real. Something I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. And that terrified me more than anything. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at a photo of Mark and me on our wedding day. We looked so happy, so certain of the life we were about to build. Where had it all gone wrong? I thought about the years we'd spent together, the love, the laughter, and eventually the slow drift apart. It hadn't happened all at once. It had been gradual, like sand slipping through my fingers. And then there was Ryan. He hadn't caused the cracks in my marriage, but he'd found his way into them, filling the empty spaces I didn't even realize existed. I hated myself for letting it happen. But I couldn't deny the truth. I had been starving for affection, for attention, for passion. And Ryan had given me all of that and more. But at what cost? My marriage was in pieces. My reputation was ruined. And Ryan, the one person who had made me feel alive again, was the last person I could be with. Because no matter how much I wanted to pretend otherwise, the guilt was always there, lurking beneath the surface, reminding me of the lines we had crossed. I stood up and grabbed my phone, staring at Mark's number. My finger hovered over the call button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. Instead, I turned to the mirror, meeting my own gaze for the first time in days. This was my mess, my mistake, and it was time to own it. I had lost myself somewhere along the way, and no man, Mark or Ryan, could fix that for me. I had to fix it myself. I took a deep breath, set the phone down, and walked outside. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. And as I stood there, letting the cool breeze wash over me, I promised myself one thing: never again. Never again would I let loneliness make me reckless. Never again would I cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Because some mistakes couldn't be undone. And this was one of them. What would you have done in Clara's situation? Could you walk away from a forbidden temptation? Or would you risk it all for one moment of passion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more shocking and emotional stories like this. And trust me, you won't believe what happens in the next one. Stay tuned.